So that is the topic, the argument for today, the differences between this expansion's Fated season compared to Shadowlands expansion Fated season, and why exactly do players feel less excited about this version of Fated compared to Shadowlands version of Fated, and also even perhaps from a psychological standpoint, why did it feel like an extra gift at the end, an extra surprise gift at the end of the expansion for Shadowlands, whereas now it feels like it has stolen the place of a real season in Dragonflight, even though the amount of content between Shadowlands and Dragonflight has been exactly the same. If anything, Dragonflight has a bit more in the small in-between patches compared to Shadowlands. The community have already started having some thoughts about the matter, some thoughts about how does it feel to have this season, right? Number one, you have the point that, and this is something that has happened before, that we have been getting 3 major tiers as part of an expansion. We have gotten a little bit spoiled with expansions like Legion and expansions like BFA back to back, giving us an extra raid. Because if you think about this expansion, you have the first raid, Vault of the Incarnates, followed by Aberrus, followed by Amir Drasil. That's 3. Before that, we had Castronatria, Sanctum, and Sepulcher. That's 3. Even prior to that, in World of the Draenor, we had Highmaul into Blackrock Foundry into Hellfire Citadel, which makes 3. It was only in the middle, it was only with Legion and with BFA that we did get the 3 full-on, full-fledged tiers. We got Nighthold into Tomb, into Antorus, and after that we got Dazara Lore into Eternal Palace, into Nyalota. The difference was that for BFA and Legion we also got Emerald, Nightmare, and Uldir at the very release of the expansion in very quick patches. They only lasted for 3 or 4 months before we got immediately the next patch right after. But besides those patches, most of the time the expansion was split into 3 tiers, not into 4. Even by vanilla standards, at the very beginning of the game, you had Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. In TBC, you had Tier 4, Tier 5, Tier 6. In Wrath, you had 7, 8, 9. The raids were genuinely split into 3 major patches and 3 major raids with 3 major tiers. So technically not much has changed. However, there are a few things that have been changing. For example, the number of raid bosses, right? The number of just big bad guys you have to defeat. Because, for example, Dragonflight, if we assume we are not getting any more surprise raid bosses, Dragonflight will be the expansion with the least amount of bosses ever since Classic, ever since Vanilla, up to now even less than something like Warlords of Draenor. Now, of course, you can still make the case that it is quality over quantity that counts, that it is the development of the bosses, not only of the bosses, but also of the boss rooms, the raid, the environment, even the voice acting, even the models, even the particle effects, as well as the complexity and the fun of the fights, right? I doubt that someone would be considering Wrath of the Lich King being superior in raids just because they had more bosses that they recycled from Naxxramas from Vanilla, and they turned it into a 10-25 man raid. Compared to that, the quality of the fewer bosses of Dragonflight is of course much higher than something like Wrath, even than something like TBC, for example, and of course Vanilla. However, for example, Dragonflight itself has somewhere in the realm of 30 to 40% less bosses than BFA. And BFA already had quite a high quality of bosses, already had no recycled bosses, no reused raids. They were all brand new, right? So that was still modern WoW. The bosses were all modern, they were all brand new, and yet we went down some 30 to 40% in the number of bosses in Dragonflight, for example. The other complaints that you might be hearing the most related to this Fated season is something that even Liquid Max, the most recent loser of the Race to World First, finishing second with Liquid, pointing out that a Fated season is fine as an addition at the end of an expansion to spice things up, but is absolutely not acceptable as a substitution for a real patch / real season, right? That is not something that is substituting the real season. As mentioned, this Dragonflight expansion was the most standard in terms of content. You have the base release with the base raid, then you have one new zone with 10.1, which was Zarlek Caverns with one new raid, and then you have another new zone with the Emerald Dream into the next raid in Amirdrasil. That was just the same amount of splits of content that we have gotten, for example, with Shadowlands. It is also more overall content than we have gotten with Warlords, where we only got Tanan Jungle as the new zone to play around throughout the expansion in Warlords. Even before Warlords, in Mists of Pandaria, for example, the major new zone was Throne of Thunder, number 1. And then number 2, you had the Isle, the Timeless Isle, which was an even smaller piece of content, but still, it was very played, very active player base in that zone. So you had 2 new zones in Mists, you had 2 new zones in Warlords, you had 2 new zones in Shadowlands, now you have 2 new zones in Dragonflight. You also had more new zones and new major patches than something like TBC, that only had the Isle of Keldanas, for example, as the new zone. Even in Wrath of the Lich King, there wasn't even a new zone. You played in the exact same spots for the entirety of the expansion, with the only very tiny addition of the Argent tournament up north in the Northrend. So that is where you have this weird split. On one side, you are aware that Dragonflight has released more content, but on the other side, you think that releasing Fated Season instead of a real season is not acceptable, even though you are aware that we did get the seasons we are supposed to be getting. Yet we still want more. It still feels like there was one more season into this expansion. There was one more season left to have in this expansion after 10.2. Both from a timing sense, because this patch came out in November, the next expansion is in next November, so you have 12 months in the middle. It was very simple to have the next raid tier 6 months from now, right, to split the year evenly. It was also making sense from a storytelling perspective, because up to this point we only got to Fyrak as the bad guy of the raid, whereas from the start of the expansion, the bad guy supposedly was Iridicron. So we had one bad guy left in the expansion, for example. So that is what feels weird about the end part of this expansion. The fact that logically we are being told the facts in front of us are telling us that the amount of content being pushed by Dragonflight is on par, is even with the rest of the expansions. It is above in terms of open world content, in terms of open world activities and zones being released than almost any other expansion prior to this one, except for BFA. And it is behind in the amount of bosses being released, purely in the amount of just enemies to go through in the raid. But on average, it seems to be on par with the rest of the expansions. Yet, there is this feeling that we could have gotten more from this expansion. There is the feeling that we could have gotten one more tier, one more major patch, one more set of content, instead of getting Fated. Now, the point about Fated is that it's not that players even dislike Fated. In fact, I would say, I don't know about you, but I would say in general, Fated Season was nicely received in Shadowlands. Especially because, and that's perhaps the biggest thing, especially because once the last raid tier of the expansion was announced, it was announced exactly as that. It was announced as the last tier of the expansion. That is perhaps the biggest misfortune about the feeling that players have towards this end of the expansion of Dragonflight. The fact that even though we have the exact same amount of raids, the exact same amount of zones, the exact same amount of major patches of Shadowlands, the feeling that we had at the release of this patch 10.2 was that there was going to be more. Whereas in Shadowlands, when we were getting towards Sepulchre of the First One's raid, we knew that was going to be the raid where you fight the jailer. You knew that was going to be the last bit of the expansion. You knew that was going to be the end. So what came after the addition of Fated After felt like an extra. It felt like something more at the end of the expansion. You were not expecting it. It came for free. It added some more nice things for content. Some in the raid, some more in Mythic Plus with the new season, right? But in Dragonflight, we got the release of the expansion, just the same as the release of Shadowlands. We got 10.1, just the same as 9.1, Cortia plus Sanctum versus Zaralek Caverns plus Aberrus, and then we got 10.2, same as Shadowlands 9.2. You get Zereth Mortis plus Sepulcher versus Amir Josil plus the Emerald Dream. So it was literally a one-to-one conversion of content from the older expansion to the newer one. Yet, many players have kept the feeling in this expansion that we might have gotten something extra. Whether it was because this expansion, Dragonflight, still had 1 year at minimum left before the release of the next expansion, 1 year of life for the duration of an expansion, which is generally 2 years. So players were like, well, obviously, if a raid tier is released 12 months away from the release of the next expansion, we are going to be getting another tier in the middle, surely. And then the other part was not knowing, being kept too long in the dark about whether or not 10.2 was going to be the end of the story, the end of the big bad enemies to defeat in this expansion. So many players, as mentioned, were assuming that clearly, since Fyrakk is not the big bad guy of this expansion, 10.2 wasn't going to be the end of the major content patches of this expansion because we haven't dealt with the big bad of this expansion. That is perhaps the worst bit about Dragonflight, because I feel that if players already made peace with themselves and already knew that this one was going to be the last patch of the expansion, would have perhaps taken the end year of the expansion better compared to how much better they took it in Shadowlands, for example, where the reaction about receiving a fated season was good. It was nice because you weren't expecting it. It was new, free content, really. So the more the better. Whereas now it was sort of the opposite. Now you were set up, you were expecting a new raid tier, brand new content, and then Blizzard says, not really. We are releasing the exact same amount of content we have released for Shadowlands, 1-to-1. 3 different content patches with 2 added raids and 2 added zones, just like we did for Shadowlands. That being said, as mentioned, I don't think Fated by itself is a bad idea. I still think it's going to be nice and refreshing, perhaps even to go back to the older raids, and more importantly, perhaps seeing what Blizzard does with Mythic Plus, which dungeons are going to be chosen, if we go back to having, for example, an extra special affix in Mythic Plus. It's just, of course, now a problem of timeline. It's gonna be, slightly demotivating to know that even if Fated comes out, it's gonna be some 6-ish months of Fated before the release of the next expansion. Especially because the Fated season of Shadowlands came out about 3.5 months before the release of Dragonflight. It came out at the start of August compared to the release of Dragonflight, which was at the end of November, basically. So 3.5, almost 4 months-ish of Fated, not close to the likely 6-something months we will be getting for this version of the Fated season in Dragonflight. That is the question I'm going to leave you for today on this Sunday. Personally, of course, I'm not a fan of this long wait time before the release of the next expansion. I don't have that many problems playing other games as I wait for more content, or jumping straight into the beta of the next expansion and ditching having to deal with Fated of Dragonflight. I just wished we still had a bit more of a squeezed release schedule if we were going to go for this type of release schedule of patches. So release of the expansion and then 0.1 patch, 0.2 patch into Fated. I feel like the expansion should be shrunk down from the 2 years expansion cycle that we have been getting so far, and made it a little bit shorter in terms of cycles of releases. That is my main wish for the following expansions, if we are indeed going to be following this style of releases for the content. But for any other judgment, I'm going to leave it down to you guys in the comments. So for today, on this Sunday. I'm going to leave you to the rest of your weekend. We are starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. And with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's starting to get real cold to have still the window open in the back. Perhaps I should be thinking about maybe closing it down, huh? How about that?